Hi there, my name is Protools and welcome to Soundpaint. In the video today, I want to take you into our new Soundpaint 2.0 update, which is a free update for our already free Soundpaint engine, and with a particular emphasis on what we call H.A.L. H.A.L is a technology that we've been developing for years that allows me, or you, to virtually become a virtuoso on any instrument of our imagination. For example, I've never played a saxophone in real life, not really, but on the keyboard now, I can totally sound like a real saxophone player, and that goes for all instruments: strings, brass, choirs, vocals, anything you can imagine. We can now do it on the keys, and it's completely fluent, effortless. It's not obstructed with all the things we've had from the past where we can only play one note or having to play overlapping keys or all the sort of usual suspects in virtual instruments. H.A.L is truly a massive step forward for us in terms of creating more realistic and lifelike instruments. As some of you guys are aware, Soundpaint was released a year ago. In this period, we've released over 100 deep sampled and ultra deep sampled instruments, vintage synthesizers, old school analog drum machines, tonal percussion instruments, guitars, pianos, anything imaginable in the cinematic scoring realm. And the one thing I keep coming back to for me is that with the first iteration of Soundpaint, we had 127 velocity layers for any dynamic instrument. But this year and this entire last year, we've been spending in heavy R&D trying to figure out how we can do the same thing for sustained instruments, particular orchestral instruments, choirs, brass, strings, all that stuff. And with H.A.L, our Hyper Acoustic Legato, we sort of had to redefine a paradigm. Imagine not being constrained just to monophonic legato anymore. Imagine not being at the mercy of crossfading and all the artifacts and phasing artifacts that come out of that. Imagine like not having to sit and fiddle with your CCs in your DAW and waste hours every day because what you played was actually not what happened inside of the DAW and you had to sit and correct everything. That doesn't happen in Soundpaint anymore. And the best way to describe Hyper Acoustic Legato is almost to think about photorealism for computer rendering. As you may know, computers can render completely realistic images or videos, which is called photorealism. It's actually an older term from painting, where painters used to paint things that were completely realistic. They're sort of hot in the 60s and the 70s. But hyperacoustics is the same for sound. I always felt that we didn't have the proper term for like realism in sound. Like sound realism sounds sort of weird, realistic sound. So for me, hyperacoustics is that. It's photorealism for sound. Now, there are two distinct features that set Soundpaint and H.A.L apart from traditional samplers like Kontakt. First, we're introducing a new sound mode called Dynamic Sustains. Dynamic Sustains is, as I described, the same feature we had in terms of generating 127 velocity layers on your keyboard, but now we can do it for the mod wheel as well. That's Dynamic Sustains. So any instrument, brass, choir, strings, all those instruments that have beautiful long sustains, they can now be dynamic, but not using traditional crossfading methods, but instead using our Morph Shading technology, which doesn't have any phasing in it. In fact, it does real-time phase alignment between all the wave files as they're generated in real time to ensure you don't get phasing artifacts. This is a little bit of nerdy talk, but it's really just a way of saying the instruments sound and feel more real. You can really feel their acoustic nature on the keys. One can almost see it like physical modeling for samples, but with all the beautiful perfect imperfections of real acoustic samples. Physical modeling or modeling techniques are awesome, but they tend to not have as many imperfections in them because they're narrow models of a much more complex acoustic reality where players are emotional, they'll weave, they'll move, they'll be evoking different kind of emotions at any moment, and those are rarely captured in physical modeling but are really, really pronounced inside of Soundpaint, and particularly with H.A.L, you can really feel the players on the keys as you move the mod wheel. But secondly, and perhaps most importantly, H.A.L also offers the ability to play polyphonic legato without any obstructions of the past. But let's take a deep sonic scuba dive into Soundpaint and check out the legato module. If you go into our rack system, you'll notice we have a new rack here called Legato, and it works right out of the gate. Up here in the very top of the module, you'll notice it says 1, 2, 3, 4. That corresponds to the 4 different parts inside of the engine. You can actually have 4 different legato modules. And because we don't have any load times, let me just load a soprano sax here on top. And notice how quickly it loads here. There's virtually no load time. This is just coming from an external, rather slowly SSD. It's super easy to create your own ensembles that way. Now we have both a tenor sax and a soprano sax, both playing legato together. If I click this little button up here, it'll link all the modules together. So whatever I do down here in terms of the different controllers will be for all the different parts. So right now I've clicked it, meaning that tenor sax and soprano sax are synchronized. Sort of a cool ensemble sound, but let's try to play those two guys polyphonic together here. You'll notice here we have something called chord timer. The chord timer is essentially like how long does the engine have to detect whether I'm playing a chord or a solo note. I like to normally have it around like 50 to 80 milliseconds, and then I'm going to take this legato time and move it up as well. Legato time means that it's auto-sustaining the notes, so I don't have to play with overlapping fingers. I never have to do that anymore. So I can essentially just play my legato. That's monophonic, but because we're in polyphonic mode, I can also go. And then I can go back and play solo as well. Now, polyphonic means a lot of different things. It actually does work in context sometimes, but when you start going in counterpoint or you start doing more complex things, it normally breaks. But just to give you a context to how easy it is to use here, keep in mind that we're using 2 legato instruments at the same time as well. It works. Counterpoint. So you have complete freedom on the keys, and I don't have to sit and think about, oh my god, I'm overlapping, or I have to play this one monophonic note and make another track. It just works. Let me just shut down the tenor sax here and play a little more with the soprano sax on its own here. It's so beautiful. And also show you how you can play solo, then go to ensemble. That would be a soprano saxophone ensemble, and then back to solo mode as well. Such a sweet vibrato on the end here as well. So right now, because we have legato time up here, it has that auto sustain function. It will sustain for a given amount of time. If I move it up here, it's going to be 2 seconds at max. So you can really just... Two seconds. Now, I can also take it all the way down here and just use my sustain pedal. You don't have to use legato time here. Sometimes I like the sustain pedal as well. So it all comes down to kind of what feel you want for your legatos. And I think that in itself is a novelty. We sort of have to get used to all of this. So many beautiful options, but it should just be easy. So sustain pedal. Let me just do the same thing here with the tenor sax instead. You notice that? When I play harder on the keys, you get more pronounced legatos. So if I just play something like down here, like playing soft, you don't get such pronounced scoops. But if I play a little bit harder, so instead of just, it becomes more like, so you can feel that more kind of note going into it. And it's hard to explain what that feels like. It's almost something you just have to try, but you very quickly get used to it. So just, it's so intuitive, and also because we have 127 velocity layers rendered in real time when I use my mod wheel here. Let me just play you a single note so you can hear what that sounds like. This is not going to be a legato note, but rather what we call a dynamic sustain. So before we get into legato, the first note that you play, if you just play here, You hear how there's no crossfading going on? And you can go all the way down to that sort of more breathy style. You can hear the rattling of the player, like that's sort of like almost like little bubbles. It sort of has a little bit of a sizzling sound. Imagine you're like cooking bacon almost. And then as you move up, all the way down, it's full control over the dynamics, but without having the normal phasing artifacts. When we crossfade, as I mentioned earlier in the video, it's not a real property of real acoustic instruments. They don't crossfade. They have a continuous transformation of the waveform. That's what's going on here. And it's super liberating when you combine it with the legato. You know, I don't play a saxophone in reality, but I have to say that it does really make me feel like I'm a virtuoso of the keys. Sure, it takes a little bit of getting used to, like, what is a saxophone lick? You know, you don't necessarily want to play it like a piano. Even though that was kind of cool, actually. I guess that reminds me about the fact that, yes, we can play run building as well. In fact, if you look down here, you'll notice we have something called legato speed. Legato speed relates to sort of how fast your music style is. If you have a slower playing style, you can move it down here towards the bottom, which is going to give a very sort of slow, slur, parlamento-like style. I normally like to keep it around neutral and a little further up here because you can still play it kind of slurred even in fast mode, but once you start playing faster, it's going to be a lot more nimble and like just agile, if you will. Okay, I think the player actually ran out of breath at that point. I talk about this sometimes, like when I play the instrument, I try to envision, like, even though I don't play the sax, like that was too long a phrase, I'm running out of breath. So I try to remind myself, you know, stay in the breathy kind of realm, like how much can I play? It would probably be like, you know. So just like a little bit of pauses. We talk about the seventh element in music being perhaps the most important one, silence. But let me just selfishly turn the chord timer up here a little bit and play polyphonically as well. This time I'm gonna let legato time stay down and just use my sustain pedal while playing polyphonic. But we can also push the polyphony further. Let me just activate the soprano sax here again and set the tenor sax to 7+ here. So now we have sort of a... But we can play that with chords too. How cool sound. You know, what a cool combo between a tenor sax and a soprano. I also love just the soprano on its own here. And let me just set that to monophonic mode here instead. You can also play old school monophonic mode. Granted, you don't have to use overlapping keys. You can if you sort of feel that's still your thing, but you don't have to. But it's just super liberating, even just being in monophonic mode as well. I often go there sometimes if I just want it super, super tight for a solo and I know I don't want any polyphony. Take it in monophonic mode because the polyphonic mode will still try, even at the tiniest level, to read your polyphonies. You don't have to worry about that in the monophonic mode. And if you notice, when I play here, I like to sort of fire off the first note, particularly when I play melodies, with a little fl. I don't know what to call them, little like flamish kind of motion on the keys. And the reason I do that is because if I just start with the sustain, it's a little more like I like to sort of go immediately into legato mode, so you'll trigger that with a little like. It's a good trick in general, and when I look at my DAW sequences for solos in particular using Soundpaint, I sort of find myself always using that little flink kind of move because it just makes it immediately more emotional. You're more on par with the player. You'll also notice that in the bottom of the legato module, we have something called legato volume that specifically refers to how loud the volume is for the interval itself. So not for the entire sound, but just that little scoop. And you can sort of massage it based on how pronounced you want the legato to be in your compositions. That's sort of a personal thing in terms of how loud you want it compared to the sustains as well. And either way, this is our H.A.L module, our Hyper Acoustic Legato. It really follows the same mantra we've always had for Soundpaint in terms of fast, furious fun. There's no load times on legato parts. One thing I haven't really shown you is how quickly you can assemble your own unique ensembles. It's a lot of fun when you have a variety of different legato instruments just to go like bloom and create new ensembles and find new orchestral colors. And quickly, let me also show you our new extended sound mode. If you click up here, you'll notice that we have an additional legato and dynamic sustains added to the sound mode. If you switch the legato off, the dynamic sustains will still work with 127 velocity layers, great for like string, choral, brass, more pad-like writing, but you still get that very organic feel in the mod wheel. We also have a couple of other features for Soundpaint 2.0. The first one is the new keyboard we've added down the bottom here. Over the next couple of months, we're going to keep adding to this. There's also going to be labels added to it so you can see what you're playing. So for example, if you're playing our hybrid instruments, you can see sort of the different octaves, what they're doing and so forth. We're also excited to announce that the free Soundpaint engine is now Protools compatible as well, so it runs in Axe. So Soundpaint works in virtually any environment you can imagine, including a standalone version, which I like to use sometimes when I don't even want to deal with the DAW and just get really, really quick into like laying something down. Soundpaint is a growing ecosystem, and even as we're speaking, we're actually prototyping the next generations of H.A.L, which are going to be released over the next couple of months. That includes strings, choirs, brass, all these sort of products that we always wanted to live in Soundpaint, but we needed to have these additional new technologies to really facilitate the dream of truly organic and acoustic instruments come true. I have a story I want to share with you. This story is personal because it relates to my own upbringing, but it's also a story about the history of sampling and how we got to this unique point where we're at now, where we can truly play realistic instruments on the keyboard. So bear with me for a few minutes. I began with samples when I was 6 years old, and I've always used the computer as a music instrument ever since. Now it's like some plus 40 embarrassing years later, and I'm still here using the computer every day as the beautiful music instrument that it's become. And in many ways as well, an homage to the great Dave Smith that invented the MIDI protocol and that I had the privilege of building this unit and some other things with him as well. Eternal memories to Dave. But deep breath. The first computer I ever used was the ZX Spectrum. It had 48 kilobytes, and then I migrated to the Commodore 64 that had 64 kilobytes and an awesome chip called the Z chip. We actually have both instruments in Soundpaint Ultra Deep Sample because I love them so much. Both the Spectrum and the Commodore 64 are awesome, underrated chiptune machines, even all these 40 plus years later. When I was in my teenagers, I spent a year and a half saving up to buy my first keyboard, which was the ASR10. It was a sampling keyboard and I had 10 megabytes in it. That was glorious, coming from 64 kilobytes in the early days. But most importantly, it allowed me to really get into start sampling things in more depth. And the ASR10 is actually still used today in hip hop and other styles because it has such a unique saturation to the sound. I still love that machine. But eventually the hardware assemblers sort of faded out and software started taking over, and the computer stepped into the full glory as a music machine as well, particularly with the birth and advent of software streaming, GigaSampler being the first of all, and really introduced a whole new paradigm that you could stream samples so you can make massive sounds and instruments compared to what we could do in the past. And it really took us a big step forward in terms of realism and fidelity. There's also EXS and Kontakt in particular. And I want to put a lot of emphasis on Kontakt because I only realized this the other day. Kontakt is 20 years old. 2 decades. not a lot of technologies survive for that long, and I really think it speaks to the majesty of the original design and architecture of an awesome sample engine. A few years later, after the birth of Kontakt, we're now in 2005, the Vienna Symphonic Library, or VSL, came out with a major innovation in terms of their true legato. Legato means that you can tie things together. It's an Italian term. So if you imagine like a violinist playing like da da, that's not really what they do. They glide between the note because it's a fretless instrument. So they go like da. That's legato. That little swoop in between, that's the legato interval, we call it. Or if you play a guitar, for example, you don't just play dang dang. You go like dang. That's legato as well. So VSL came out with it. And while it was monophonic, meaning that you could only play one note at a time, it was truly innovative. And the way they did is that you could play a normal note by clicking down a key, but if you play overlapping keys, it would trigger the interval. And that's sort of still where we're at today. And something I found very unintuitive, but we had to do it because of technological restrictions. It wasn't because anyone wanted that way. It was essentially the way it had to be because we didn't have the technology. But anyway, VSL invented legato over 17 years ago. And by my observations, the sample scene sort of froze. And even to this day, most instruments are still monophonic. They still require you to play with overlapping keys. And it's strange to me because it's certainly not for the lack of trying. Like in the case of H.A.L, we probably have the largest deep sample catalog of instruments in the world. And I've created hundreds of legato instruments and always just accepted the premise that, well, it's going to be monophonic. It's going to require overlapping keys. I'm at the mercy of crossfading, which is also a strange technology because in real life, waves don't mix. Crossfading is essentially mixing two waveforms together. But if you think about a violin, for example, when you play it, if they go into vibrato, they don't mix notes. It's a continuous transformation of the same note that's being emitted. Always in transformation, but no mixing together. That's resolved with our H.A.L technology as well. So there's a lot of small acoustic phenomena that really creates these beautiful instruments, and that's what we're going to get deeper into in this video here. But I say this with great humbleness as well because I've spent 2 decades trying to figure this out. I've tried and tried, our teams have tried, not because anyone didn't want it that way, but more because of the technological limitations. If one really thinks about it, Kontakt was invented before legato was even a thing, so it was never embedded in the core foundation of the engine. And over time, we and many other developers have learned to sort of script our way out of it. But there's a very important distinction between using a 20-year-old scripting system to try to resolve an issue, or essentially use brand new code bases and build it from ground up some 20 years later. That's the difference. But before we really get into things, I sort of just want to wrap up my story because it all sort of strangely ties together. When I was in high school, I got like the worst grades a human can possibly get. In fact, by the Danish education system, my grades were so bad that I only had 2 academic options left once I was done with high school. I could either become a priest or I could become a librarian. And I still vividly remember looking at sort of different stats for the studies and all of a sudden seeing that in the library studies there was a 9-to-10 gender ratio of females. So I was like, oh my God, that's going to be my study. And by magical means, I spent 4 years and got a master's in library science. And then later on, I got another master's in information science about future prediction and technologies. And then eventually, I don't know how this happened really, but I ended up being a PhD scholar in artificial intelligence and music systems, which is what brought me to the United States as well. And fun fact, by the way, I've never had any formal music training. I'm completely self-taught. So for all of you guys out there that haven't done it, there's some level of hope. You know, we don't have to train in a formal way. Maybe the computer is really our teacher. It certainly has been for me as well. You know, I learned about orchestral instruments just by playing them on the keyboard. And that's sort of its own education, if you will. Maybe it doesn't always require language to be taught something. Sometimes we can learn with our ears. Never thought about that before. Anyway, as an aspiring PhD scholar and perhaps a little bit snobby at times, I came up with a concept called microscoring. And I was lucky enough to implement this into a variety of Tomb Raider video games. Microscoring is really the idea about taking a score and breaking it down in tiny segments. These segments are then combined in real time as the player interacts with the game, so the score can shape itself around the actions or interactions that the player has with the video game. I've used this method on many other games. I've scored Overwatch 1 and 2, I used it on Transformers and Counter-Strike and Need for Speed and many other video game franchises, which is my specialty. But in the process of scoring all these video games, I sort of became frustrated with some of the instruments I had. I didn't feel they always spoke to me emotionally in the way I wanted them to. I would play some string patches and they were like, no, this is not strings, this is just like pads of sonic soup, but I'm not feeling the human emotion inside of them. And I say that because for me, the whole journey about ADO and getting into sampling was actually born out of video games and my own desire and frustration for not having the right instruments to compose with. So here we are today. I'm just realizing right now as I'm talking, like I used to take scores and break them down into micro scores, and I've been calling myself a decomposer for the last 2 decades or something, because I don't really find myself being a composer so much anymore, but more someone who breaks down compositions into scores, break down the scores into instruments, break down the instruments into samples, and now with the advent of Soundpaint and having built our own technology, breaking the instruments down to individual waveforms. And I spend a lot of my mortal life right now, and for the last many years, just listening to waveforms. Like for example, an old analog synthesizer, just listening to the oscillator itself. I remember Michelle Moog talked about her dad, Bob Moog, and how he would listen to the electrons pass through the circuitry of the original Moogs. I really cannot say enough about how beautiful it is to listen to the building blocks of music that way. So when I listen to an old oscillator run through an old filter, I can hear the electricity in it, like all the juice and the life within the sound. I very much perceive acoustic instruments the same way. It's always looking for life. And for me, the whole thing is really like, imagine you're cooking. If you have good ingredients, the likelihood of you making a great meal are a lot higher than if you have like, bad prefab kind of stuff. So I look at it the same way with waveforms. If I can find a beautiful waveform, then the likelihood of me making beautiful music is higher. So when I talk about having been a decomposer for so long, it's really the journey of breaking music down to instruments, breaking the instruments down to samples, and ultimately break the samples down to individual waveforms at the lowest level of the DNA in the waveform, and appreciate that as well, because that's where the music truly begins. But with all that said, and maybe this is where this story sort of takes a darker turn, if you will, I actually didn't feel that even with ADO that we could push it further. This is about 7 years ago. I felt that the instruments were sort of hitting the same wall, that yeah, we'd made some progress and some steps forward and certain instruments were beautiful, but overall I didn't feel I had a lot more to contribute. And this is also a part where I felt the industry froze a little bit. Yeah, we can add more microphones and make fancy UIs or whatever. We can keep slapping new graphics on the Contact engine and say we have a new engine, but it's still the same Contact engine with the same effects, 20 years old, whatever. But for me, I was like, I'm done. I don't really have more to contribute, and I'm running out of ideas as well. So yeah, that was like my midlife crisis, if you will. And for about a year, I would walk around the vineyards. Back then we lived up in Napa, which is where a lot of the California wines are grown. So we have all these different vineyards. And I would go through the vineyards and just think about my misery and my midlife crisis and what do I want to do. And the only thought I had in my mind is that I wanted to do something with water, because I think water is such a precious, godly material. It's so unique in its properties. And I have no background in water conservation. What is it about water? Like, do you want to try to figure out how to grab water through the air? I had no idea. But I just had this inner voice just telling me, like, you got to work with water. And I did that for a year, and we were still building ADO instruments, but it was really, really difficult time because it's hard to lose your motivation and then keep doing it. And this midlife crisis, sample developer crisis went on for about a year. I would walk through the vineyards, think about water every single day. And one day, and I remember the exact spot I was standing on behind our house, it hit me. You have to create a liquid audio format that has the same properties of water waves, but it has to take the shape of anything it wants to become. And I still remember this so vividly. I was standing behind the house and I got the idea, and I stood still for 1 minute and just said, fuck. It really, really hit me in a profound way. I ran into the studio, I smoked a joint, I went to YouTube and I typed in like water or something, and a video with Bruce Lee, the great martial artist, came up where he talked about the properties of water. If you pour water into a vase, it becomes the vase. If you pour it into a cup, it becomes a cup. Be water, my friend. And this might sound strangely philosophical, but for me, that really, really clarified for me what it was about. It was about creating a brand new audio format from the ground up that had the properties and behavior of water, because thereby it could become everything. And that also meant that things, for example, like velocity layers didn't have to exist. If we had water-like formats, we would be able to have an infinite amount of velocity layers. And that's really where Soundpaint 1.0 began. As you may know, in Soundpaint 1.0, we have 127 velocity layers generated in real time. They're rendered in real time as you play them, which makes the instruments a lot more elastic. That was sort of the first way of working with this liquid audio format. But today we're taking a step further, but it's all based on the same concept of having something that's liquid, because water is life, music is a reflection of life. And if we can embed that at the lowest level, whether it's the beautiful oscillators or it's a new audio format or it's H.A.L that can now allow us to play Polyphonic Legato and all that stuff, it all comes back to the same essence. It's alive. Now, an idea is only as good as its execution. So I remember discussing Soundpaint with Tanya and her being so kind and supportive in terms of really wanting this whole vision to come true, investing the time, the resources, the money to make it happen, but also spent the time gathering the right team. And I say that because without our team, we wouldn't be here. Yeah, crazy ideas and all that stuff, but they got to be executed. Matt, our brilliant lead programmer, has been able to take my mad ideas over the years and get them into actuality. Our whole team has just been there to support us, and it's important for me to underline that these things don't just happen by themselves, and our team is at least half of it. But for now, this is all we got. True polyphonic legato using morph shading synthesis, the ability to real-time render 127 dynamic sustains without any phasing artifacts. In other words, it feels like water on the keys. I'm closer connected to the instruments. And to me, this truly embraces the mantra that I've always had for Soundpaint, which is to shorten the distance from my thought to my creation even more profoundly. So I can't wait for you guys to try it. This is just the first out of many iterations of Soundpaint. I've actually planned 8 generations. This would be generation 2 right now. So there's a lot more to come, but this is where we're at. So thank you so much for watching. I hope I haven't taken too much of your time. If my enthusiasm is not obvious, then try it for yourself. See if you feel it too, you know? Because ultimately, music is a reflection of life, and the technology should be as well. So thanks for watching.